This is the 7th episode in a bonus series of Real Democracy Now!, a podcast talking about deliberation, culture and context.
What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now!
Welcome to Real Democracy Now! I'm Nivek Thompson, and Real Democracy Now! Is a podcast for people who think we can and should improve how democracy works. This podcast looks at democracy from different angles to help you think about how democracy might be improved.
Welcome to episode 7 in this special bonus series of Real Democracy Now!, a podcast about deliberation, culture and context. This bonus series has been made in collaboration with the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the University of Canberra. In this series, I speak with a number of people who participated in the Centre's conference in December 2017, which brought together scholars from around the world to examine the different forms, meanings and significance associated with deliberation in various cultures and contexts. The conference was supported by John Dryzek's ARC Laureate Fellowship entitled Deliberative Worlds, Democracy, Justice and a Changing Earth System. In this episode, I'm speaking with Dr. Ian O'Flynn.
Hi, I'm Ian O'Flynn. I'm a senior lecturer in political theory at Newcastle University in the UK. I'm interested in deliberative democracy and specifically in the implications of deliberative democracy for deeply divided societies, places like Northern Ireland, Belgium, Bosnia, Lebanon, and so on. I also work on more theoretical issues like deliberative democracy and shared intentions, and I have a growing interest in deliberative democracy and compromise.
Ian spoke with me about his work on deliberation in divided societies.
What's the relationship in your mind between deliberative cultures and deeply divided societies like Northern Ireland and Belgium that you mentioned?
Well, I guess one of the big issues is whether culture, especially when culture is bound up with identity, and identity is bound up with deep-seated ethnic antagonisms, whether all of that actually gets in the way of deliberation, or whether deliberation, perhaps the process of deliberation is in some sense more universal, that it actually can cut through those kind of antagonisms, provided that we create the conditions for people to do so.
What's your experience of how deliberation has actually operated in practice in those countries?
Well, I guess the first real experience I've had of trying to see how deliberation works empirically in divided societies was as part of a deliberative poll that I organised with Jim Fishkin and Bob Lushkin. This was a poll that was about education reform in Northern Ireland. And of course, as you know, education is extremely important because it really is one of the vehicles through which actually culture is reproduced. So you would expect education to be a very vexed issue, which it is and has been for a long time in Northern Ireland. But again, our challenge was to create conditions under which, in this case, a random sample of the population could come together and a debate about education reform moving forward into the future. The topic was very much a live issue simply because at the time there was a falling enrolment, so there was pressure really to close schools. And as part of that, actually, I think the government saw it as an opportunity to try and encourage greater sharing in the education system. Northern Ireland has a very divided education system. There's effectively a Protestant education system and a Catholic education system. So our aim was to see what would happen if you brought people from the different traditions together to debate about their children's future. What was very interesting about it was I think that what we gave them was a topic that in a way cut across the divide. Yes, as I said just a little while ago, education is linked to culture, but it's also linked to the future of their children just as children. And what we found was really that, well, actually, politicians tell us that Northern Ireland is very, very divided, which it is. But it seemed that actually on this issue, at least, people weren't as divided as we expected. They became less divided at the end of the process. So, for example, we know that because they came to see each other as more open to reason, which suggests that they did deliberate and actually it produced a very positive benefit, the type of benefits that deliberative Democrats hope deliberation will produce. More recently, I've been working on a project with some former PhD students of mine in Kirkuk. Kirkuk is a deeply contested city, not just within Iraq, but actually right across the region. So Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and of course the US and the European Union also have an interest in the fate of Kirkuk as a city. In this case, however, the findings weren't anywhere near as positive. People started on the low end of various scales and ended up on the low end of various scales. So one of the things we're interested to find out now moving forward is why that's the case. Why does deliberation seem to work in one divided society but not in another? Was it, for example, that the conditions that we created weren't reasonable enough or propitious enough for deliberation to succeed? We don't know, but there's some very interesting questions here moving forward.
I wonder, Ian, do we know very much about whether deliberation works totally different cultures altogether? For instance, in the Middle East, what do we know about deliberation there? It could be that it was to do with the deeply divided nature, or it could be that deliberation is, and I think some people have spoken about this, more of a Western construct. Do you have any sense of that?
Well, I guess the truth is we don't know. That kind of research hasn't been done. My own sense is, however, that really deliberation is a universal phenomenon. People deliberate everywhere. People want to assess issues on their merits. They want to bring good reasons to bear. People often change their mind in response to what they hear. However, I guess the real issue is the sorts of reasons that are likely to be convincing. It may be that deliberation as a process is universal, but as I said, the substantive reasons, the kind of things that people are likely to find convincing, or the kind of things that are likely to move people in one direction rather than another, they may vary tremendously across cultures. But as I say, at this point, I think we just don't know enough about that.
Well, how did you come to be involved in this particular workshop?
Well, this is actually my second time visiting John Dryzek Centre. The last time I visited the centre was at the ANU, and, well, it was wonderful. So I was extremely keen to come back again. So I applied for the International Distinguished Visitor Scholarship here at the ANU with help from Nicole Curato, and thankfully we got it. So it's just a wonderful place to be. Now, really, it was just fortuitous that the conference was on at the same time. I mean, I was due to come this year, but for one reason or another, it was only at this stage in the year that I could actually come. So it's really just accidental, but a very nice accident, I must admit.
So you've done the work in Ireland, you've done the work in the Middle East. What other areas are you hoping to work on to tease out this issue about deliberation, culture and deeply divided societies?
I would like to do more cases, obviously, and I would like to build kind of more robust deliberative processes in divided societies. That, of course, requires a lot of money, I think, to do. But I have a more kind of abstract philosophical interest in all of this as well. I've done some work, which I've published in the British Journal of Political Science, on the development of shared intentions. The concept of sharing or togetherness is very, very important for these societies because that's precisely what they lack. However, it's not clear what sharing would look like or what would constitute sharing in these kinds of cases, nor is it clear how deliberation links to sharing. So I've done some work around the idea of shared intentions, which is an idea that's been explored at length in the philosophy literature, in the philosophy of action literature. It's a very dry literature, very abstract, but I think it has some very important insights into what sharing might look like when you could actually say that people are sharing an intention or building shared intentions. And I think it's got tremendous implications for thinking about why deliberation is so important to that process. Basically, as I argue in the paper I mentioned just a little while ago, deliberation is important because it involves a richer, more robust, deeper intentions than, say, for example, bargaining. Now, if you know anything about the deeply divided society literature, you know that the standard assumption is that when people engage, when they try, for example, to negotiate a peace agreement, it will be bargaining. So the stock assumption is that what people do when they engage is bargain. But it may well be the case that there is more scope for deliberation. In fact, I happen to think that deliberation is going on, but people aren't recognizing it because of their obsession with bargaining these kinds of cases. So, for example, William Zartman, a well-known negotiation scholar, makes a very interesting case that in many of these negotiation or peace agreements, justice matters greatly. It's not just about about the balance of advantage. It's not just about the force that people can bring to bear. It's also about matters of right or wrong, matters of fairness. And it seems to me that you can't really address questions of justice, questions of fairness and so on through a bargaining paradigm. You need something like deliberation. For example, fairness requires us to be impartial. It requires us to weigh each person's interest equally in the balance. The fact that I want something is irrelevant. The fact that I want it is irrelevant. The question is it fair? So it seems to me that first of all, we need to conceptualize more the role of deliberation in these kinds of settings. And we need to think about the advantages that, in theory at least, it might have over the more traditional bargaining approach. And then, of course, we need to see how all of this plays out in practice. But as I say, that will require a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a committed team, I think.
One of the things that jumps out for me from what you've just said is deliberation is very different from negotiation and bargaining. And I totally understand the importance of fairness and justice. But how do you see deliberation working when people do have, in deeply divided societies, what they see as fundamentally conflicting needs and issues, and what is fair to one group cannot be met without at the same time being unfair to another group? That seems to be really fundamental to these deeply divided societies, is that the people see what each of them needs and wants and considers to be appropriate is the opposite of the other person, the other group.
That's a great question. I mean, it is the case that sometimes we talk about fairness as if it was obvious. I mean, it is in some cases. We know how to divide a cake. You cut, I choose. That's pretty fair, I guess. But you are right, when it comes to deeply divided societies, one of the enduring problems is that people have different notions about what constitutes fairness. Everybody sees himself to some extent or another as a victim. And so really the real challenge in all of this is to try and create conditions where these different ideas of fairness can be assessed fairly, where they can be assessed on their merits, where they can be assessed impartially. That is an absolutely massive challenge. I think that really one of the things that happen in, say, for example, deliberative mini-publics is that they try and create conditions where at least discussions of this sort can begin to take place. Now, at this point, I really have no idea how you would get from the safe, secure, balanced conditions of a mini-public and how we would move from there to actually the broader society. For the Northern Ireland poll that I mentioned a while ago, one of the things we did with that was actually we had it filmed by BBC. It became part of a BBC documentary. It was also reported on by the New York Times, the Financial Times, the Irish Times, and a couple of local newspapers. So we did at least try to create conditions in which people could actually express what they meant by fair. They may not have been able to decide at the end of all of that on an agreed view of what would be fair, but at least there was space, I think, for people to articulate their different conceptions of fairness. And we had mechanisms in place to be able to kind of disperse those different ideas of fairness across the public sphere. So I think the first stage is to get it out there, to make sure that these different ideas of what fairness are can be expressed in a kind of a safe setting, where people don't feel panicked, where people can feel safe, where they don't feel intimidated, where there isn't so much groupthink, where it's anonymous, and then where we can actually transmit some of those ideas to the broader public sphere using things like, well, ideally, impartial newspapers, impartial television stations, and so on. But it is a massive challenge. I mean, we're very much... I guess we tend to think of deliberative democracy as something that's been running for an awful long time. But really, in the grander scheme of things, if you think right back to, Aristotle, it hasn't been running that long, at least not in its present incarnation. And certainly the study of deeply divided societies is absolutely only in its infancy. Really, the study hasn't been running for much more than 15 years at the most. So we know very, very little about it. Part of the problem as well is that there are very few people involved in the study of deliberation and deeply divided societies. You can probably count them on the fingers of your hands. That's a real shame, actually, because I think, well, along with things like environmental degradation, racism, and so on, deeply divided societies, the problems of ethnic conflict are some of the greatest challenges that we face today. And yet, for whatever reason, deliberative democrats have been slow to pick up on them. I think part of the problem is that, well, really, to get the grips with deeply divided societies, you do have to spend some time in them. And plus, it also involves learning a huge new literature. The literature on ethnic conflict is quite established in comparison to the literature on deeply divided, on deliberation in deeply divided societies. So really, there are huge challenges, huge amounts of work to be put in. And as I said a while ago, it's also a resources issue.
In season 1 of the podcast, I interviewed Professor Fishkin about deliberative polling, and he was very clear that he didn't see consensus as being a requirement in deliberative polling, and yet in deliberative mini-publics, in the more traditional citizens' jury type approach, consensus is something which is a goal, if not a requirement. And consensus does seem to me to be something which is one of the bigger challenges in terms of deliberation and deeply divided societies. How do you see those notions coming together?
Well, first of all, I think that consensus is getting a bit of a bad name or has a bit of a bad name in deliberative democracy circles. I think that's a real shame, and I think it confuses a number of things. First of all, it seems to me that if you think of deliberation as a concept, as a phenomenon in the world, it seems to me that when we deliberate as a conceptual requirement or a conceptual presupposition of that kind of activity, we do think that we do this because we want to reach a consensus. As I say, it's a conceptual matter. Empirically, of course, we know that consensus is very, very difficult to reach, and that may explain why, in an effort to make deliberation, deliberative democracy more practical, more like the world as we find it, I think a lot of deliberative democrats have retreated from consensus. But however, it seems to me that it is actually a conceptual requirement of the activity that we know of as deliberation. When it comes to deeply divided societies, I mean, it's a very good question again. I think one of Jim Fishkin's reasons for avoiding consensus is because he thinks that the pressure to arrive at a decision can bring in a lot of cognitive distortions. It can force groupthink. It can lead some people to try and intimidate others so that they get their way. So in other words, consensus in practice, as opposed to the kind of conceptual requirements of the idea of deliberation, consensus can distort what goes on within deliberative mini-publics like deliberative polls. However, on the other hand, it's not entirely true to say that Jim Fishkin is against consensus, because actually, he uses a pre-test and a post-test format. So often what people who conduct deliberative polls will find is that actually there is consensus, but the consensus is not achieved through, say, for example, taking a majority vote at the end of the day or requiring some sort of unanimity rule to be applied, but it's actually found in the post-test questionnaires. There may be consensus, but Jim Fishkin and Bob Lushkin are fairly clear they don't want to push it because of the distorting effects that it can have. So they're not against it. They just think the best mechanism for finding out if there is a consensus is the post-deliberation questionnaire. I think that's probably right for divided societies. Again, you're talking about very fraught situations where kind of really diametrically opposed identities are at stake, diametrically opposed aspirations for the future are in play. So it's probably a wise thing not to push consensus. We can get it anyway in the post-deliberation questionnaires.
So is your view that the deliberative polling is a better model for divided societies than that face-to-face deliberative mini-public citizens' jury type process?
Well, there are some major differences between citizens' juries and deliberative polls. The poll is important, I think, because it uses random sampling. So you have the samples are usually pretty big, so you get a lot of diversity. The problem with citizens' juries is that the numbers are often very small, anywhere between 12 and 24, say. I think diversity is important. Bigger samples are important because actually in divided societies, there is probably a lot more diversity within each group or within each community than we're often led to believe. Politicians often have a vested interest in portraying a very monolithic view of what these different communities are like. But actually, in my experience, they're actually very often very internally diverse. People within them have very different ideas about what the group means, what the group identity stands for, and what the future of the group should be moving forward. So at least the bigger samples used in deliberative polls, I think, are more able to capture that kind of internal diversity.
And Ian, I'm not actually that familiar with the literature, extensive literature on deeply divided societies. And so putting aside deliberative democracy and deliberative processes, what have academics found, people doing research in this area found in the past, if anything, has actually been useful in terms of bringing the different parts of a society together? Is it really around topics, like, for instance, the example you gave in Northern Ireland of education, where I can understand to a certain extent that there'd be some principled agreement amongst parents in regard to children? What do we know already?
Well, in a way, the answer is not a lot, at least not a lot in terms of the type of question that you asked. The reason for that is a lot of the ethnic conflict literature, certainly not all of it, but a good deal of, a fair chunk of the ethnic conflict literature is concerned with institutional design, especially if you think, for example, of the work of Leipart, the kind of die-in of American political science. Leipart was especially concerned with designing power-sharing institutions, and in particular with what he called consociation and power-sharing institutions. That tradition has been continued by people like Brendan O'Leary and John McGarry, and they've had long-running debates about, with people like Donald Horowitz. So really what they're focused on primarily is institutions. And since they're focused primarily on institutions, what they're concerned about is elite behaviour and how institutions shape elites. Most of the ethnic conflict literature, at least the bits that I think that are inspired by Leipart, have very little to say about ordinary people. In fact, very often the attitude is that ordinary people should be kept out of all of this. What we need are elites who are both willing and able to forge compromises that bridge divides, or at least accommodate different aspirations without ever actually resolving them. So really the literature is about institutions and it's about elites. It's not about ordinary people terribly much. Ordinary people are usually assumed that ordinary people are simply too frightened, too insecure, too vulnerable, and so therefore, as far as possible, should be kept out of it. Leave it to elites to get on with it, basically.
Elites, though, would see themselves as responding to the divisions and the values and the aspirations of the different groups within their society in those settings, wouldn't they?
Well, they might, but they might also have their own agendas. We actually don't know how closely elite opinion either drives or maps onto popular opinion. We just don't know those kind of things. It's very hard to conduct good surveys in divided societies. Say, for example, in the Middle East, it's not even clear how you go about it. So it's not clear whether, as I say, that elites are driving popular opinion, determining popular opinion, or whether actually popular opinion is actually more polarised than elites themselves. We just don't know. I mean, there is some work beginning to emerge from the US about this, about who's responsible for what. Is it elites that polarise opinion, or elites in effect chasing after an already polarised electorate? There is a bit of work coming out on, as I say, from the US on that question, but so far at least we know very, very little about that in deeply divided societies.
What else is on your agenda?
Well, I usually like to have both kind of some theoretical or philosophical issues on the go and also some empirical projects. So I mentioned a little while ago that I've been doing some work around the philosophical notion of a shared intention. I'd like to do a bit more about that to see, how it relates to issues like compromise and so on. But also I'd like to perhaps continue with some more empirically oriented projects like the Kirkuk project that I mentioned a while ago. And I think that's about it. I'm kind of busy with those things at the moment, so I haven't thought too much further along the line. Those things that keep me really busy, and I expect them to keep me busy for the foreseeable future.
In the final 3 episodes in this bonus series, I'll be speaking with Professor John Parkinson, Dr. Quinlan, Bowman and Professor John Dryzek, reflecting on the conference overall. I hope you'll join me then.
Thanks for listening to Real Democracy Now! You can find more about today's topic in the show notes at www.realdemocracynow.com.au. If you enjoyed this program, please subscribe to this podcast, write a review, share the podcast with your friends, and join the conversation on the webpage or on Facebook or Twitter. I'd love to know what you think is the essence of a real democracy.